Welcome to the Baal Shem Kolel in the Temple Tzedek Kolel in the holy city of Tzfas. Today we have a very, very, very special class, and it's very, very interesting. All of history, everybody looks at life like it's going downhill. It's so bad. It's never been worse. You look at, I think it's what Plato writes about the children of his time, right? So it's time of Greece, and Greece was, in a way, doing very well. They were doing financially well. They were doing militarily well. They were in a time, whenever people have time to dabble in philosophy, things are good. Why? Because I taught in university, and I realized one of the best things that actually happened to me was teaching in university because I had a lot of respect. Einstein actually says Jews, there are two things they have in common, kind of good hearts, and the other thing is they have a respect for education. So the story is that I had that respect until I actually taught in university. And I realized this is just an intellectual Disneyland, right? It's not far from being about the truth. People that are intelligent, some people, like roller coaster rides, and some people like dabbling in intelligence. And that's really what Aristotle and the Greek philosophy was. And as we know, the Rebbe speaks very much about it. And that's why there was it's very interesting because even till this very day, we have this argument between kind of Greek philosophy. If you want to, what's Greek philosophy? At the end of the day, it's like kind of what the human mind can discover, science, and religion. And that's where they say that Aristotle, towards the end of his life, he actually told his disciple, was Alexander the Great. He says, "You might kill me for this, but I realize that the Jewish wisdom is the truth. That is the truth." And Aristotle actually came with very deep ideas, even about how Shem is one in the universe and things like that. But the interesting thing about that it says the Chassidus, the starting point of Aristotle and the starting point of Chassidus, the starting point of Judaism, the exact opposite starting points. And that's the key. The key is the understanding the starting point. Why? Because the starting point of Aristotle, and if you want to call it, a secular intelligence, is that number one, the world is about me, and I have an interest in discovering more. So the very first subject is I, and from that I comes all other subjects. And because it's like a building that's built on a bad foundation, so for example, if somebody's starting point in life is, let's say, me, and then he says, okay, how am I going to become, I don't know, rich and famous? I'm going to build a big company. Everyone's going to know my name, and I'm going to be wealthy. So what's your starting point? Your starting point is you and your name. So anything that serves that will be part of your agenda. Anything that takes away from that will be against your agenda. That's how we see the kings of the olden days, because thank God, actually, we still have some kings in the Arab countries and that. But what was their starting point? The starting point was their own ego. So therefore, what was the result? Result was their ego. So anything that served their ego, good. Anything not, even if they had to kill 100,000 people, they didn't mind because it was all about their ego. And on the flip side, the starting point of Avraham Avinu, the founder of Judaism, is not about his ego. So what was the starting point of Avraham Avinu? Avraham Avinu's starting point is, what does Hashem want? It's a fundamental different question. And we said this before, everything, if you're building a building, the foundation, I've been to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's very interesting to me. A whole building that's leaning. So why? Because the foundation is leaning. It's not the first floor is leaning. The first floor is fine. But the foundation is like this, so everything else like that. And if your foundation in life is the wrong question, so your reaction, your result in life is the wrong result. And so from the point of secular science, I said before, what's the foundation? The foundation is my ego, my metzius, my existence. So what happens then is, okay, anything that's going to expand my existence, anything that's going to make me well-known good. And chas v'shalom, something is going to reduce my existence. I can go crazy for it. People, that's why people get very, Aristotle was not Aristotle, Einstein was, he said, never follow the state against your conscience. You look at, for example, the stories in the First World War, right? What was the First World War about? One German, because unfortunately Germany, they're born with a very big ego. So he was an expansion of the Khazar's empire, right? So he sends all these people to war for what? So he can have another country. What do you care? Your life isn't good enough. You have a nice palace. What's your issue? In fact, when Napoleon came close by here, when he came to Eretz Yisrael, they say it was in Tzfas, actually. Very interesting. I don't know. He was definitely in the north of Eretz Yisrael. Maybe it was Haifa, or maybe it was Tveria or something. It was could be. Wherever it was, somewhere in this, it wasn't so far from here. I forgot there was a name of the tzaddik. Some French soldiers came to steal in his house, and he was a makubal, and they got frozen. And so they told Napoleon about this. So Napoleon either came to the tzaddik or asked the tzaddik to come to him. And he said, Napoleon, they say, was a big sorcerer. So he realized this guy can be on my team. So he asked him to join him, help him out. So he said to him a very important line. He said, you have been gifted with great talents. Napoleon was a very, very bright man. And your job is to create peace. Now, what did he actually do? He created war. Why? Because of his ego. In fact, we find this with Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great interviewed Chama. I really want to make a book once, which is the rabbis and the emperors. Fascinating questions, very interesting. The questions between, maybe you can help me. You're good at the resourcing Gemara, but it's really just putting it all together. Fascinating questions, like the interchanges between literally rabbis and emperors. So Alexander the Great had the rabbis come to him. One of his questions was: is it better to be an adventurer or to be just like a normal guy? So they said, because he was a big adventurer, they said better to be normal. How do we know this? Because the person on sea is always looking for dry land. And the vart is that eventually that's what killed Alexander the Great. He was an adventurer. I don't know if he caught a disease somewhere, and he died a young man. So his own ego killed him. And that's always what happens with these people. Their own ego destroys them.
What about some?
Some adventure is a good idea. Some adventure is a nice idea. You don't want to.
1 month a year.
There you go. 1 month a year. I'm all for that, right? Even us, we have Tishrei, we have a month of holidays, 1 month a year. So, getting back to the subject, we have the idea of what's the Jewish. Where does Yiddishkeit start? Yiddishkeit starts at a different question. It's not the question that we exist. And the famous story there, Chassid tells a Masnagid once that you think about God all day. So he's very, very happy to hear it. He says, why? Because you know that you exist, so you're always busy with God. But I know that only the Eibusher exists, so I'm always busy. Do I exist? Do I not exist? So the question of Avraham Avinu is the real question in life. It's not a question of, do I exist or not? The question is, why do we exist? What's the point of existence in the first place? Once you have that question, you can come to the right answer. And once you have the right answer, there's a line that I like to repeat, which is harder than it is to find the truth is doing the truth that you found, right? Many of us have had that question. What is the point of life? And ironically, that is an intellectual question because a person feels like this is pointless. But then the next question is doing what it is that you figure it out. A friend of mine, Dr. Waldman, very bright guy, he came closer to Chabad. He said he's very impressed with the Rebbe. Why is he so impressed with the Rebbe? He's a descendant of Baal Shem and stuff. He became a little closer to Yiddishkeit. He says the Rebbe never changed his message. And it's a deep concept. In other words, the Rebbe had truth, and the truth that he believed in 1940 was what he believed in 1950. What he believed in 1960, 70, 80, 90. He never changed what is the truth. And that's a very, very powerful thing. And that's what it says in Kabbalah and Sefer Yetzirah. It says, Hakeim bevina v'avein b'chachma. That a person needs to have chachma and bina. In other words, chachma is what is the fundamental truth, and then you're implementing it. But usually what happens in life, you get so busy in the next stage, in the implementation stage, you forget why you're even doing this in the first place. And that's why somebody that's really connected to the Hashem, because ultimately, what is the truth? And that's really what this class is about, is understanding of what is the truth. Why do we exist in the first place? And this is what it says. We've mentioned it before, but it's worth mentioning again. Two people come to a river, right? A rabbi and a scientist. And they see in the river, there's ripples. And so the scientist says, based on these ripples, I can tell that 2 minutes ago, a guy threw in a pebble, and the pebble was, I don't know, two inches in diameter, and he threw it in with a force of, I don't know, 10 degrees, but a lot of chachma, a lot of wisdom. And the rabbi says, but I'm wondering, why did somebody throw in a pebble? The question is not so much in life what happened. The question is, why did it happen? The question is not so much how are we going to expand our knowledge, and even knowledge, and this is the problem with knowledge, we see this very clearly, is that if it's not grounded on the question of why, it becomes part of the person's ego. Oh, now I know more. Now I know more. And we're seeing this with the intellectual classes, whether it was the Greek intellectual class, whether it's the current quasi-intellectual class. One thing that I gained in university was a tremendous understanding that those people that call themselves intellectuals are far from intellectuals. They're basically just regurgitating words that maybe one or two bright people say. And in any event, the bottom line is that what is the bottom line is that if your question in life is why do we exist, then you have the right question. If it's just about my existence, then actually, like Shem HaMelech says, the dog passes away, the cow passes away. So if you just hear and you played around in an intellectual game for a couple of years, it's not going to matter. And so what does matter then is the why. So Hasidus really gives us that why. It explains to us why we exist. And to understand why we exist, we really, there's three things that I believe is the quintessential point of why we exist. The first, and this is how I heard from Rabbi Yossi Jacobson, and he obviously quotes it, I think he quotes it from Kabbalah. But we know the most important prayer, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. God is one. One of the most famous teachings on Shema Yisrael is why does it say Echad, Aleph Ches Dalet? If you say God is the only, because really the whole idea of Shema is that God is the only. The Yichud Hashem, that's the mitzvah the Rambam quotes when he speaks about Yichud Hashem, that God is the only. The answer is because if God wanted to be the only, he wouldn't have made us. God didn't want to be the only. God wanted there to be many. As we say in the American dollar, e pluribus unum, the benefit of many, the many to one. And this is something that is even more beautiful than being one. Why? Because if a person is one, then they could be the best one in the world, the biggest tzaddik, but it's lonely. But a person has an imperfect, no marriage is perfect, but they have an imperfect marriage. Imperfect marriage is much better than a perfect bachelor. It's much nicer. And so, unity, people sitting together. I heard this recently from Rabbi Jacobson. The only time it says in all of the Tanakh, all of the Torah, it's both good and sweet, is when it says Sheves Achim Gam Yachad. People are together. And so it's a good and sweet thing. So this is a beautiful thing. So why did Hashem make the world? Hashem made the world for unity. And we have to understand there are many, many forms of unity in this world. But one of the most important things of understanding unity is that in order for there to be unity, there has to be difference. One of the big mistakes that kind of some of these secular idealistic psychologies make, or ideologies make, is they want everybody to be the same. So, right. So it doesn't work. Why? Because if everybody's the same, then there is no such thing as unity. There's nothing special about being with yourself. Yourself, you're quite used to. What makes, in fact, the more different someone is, the more special it is. It's one of the benefits of men and women, for example, is they like each other because they're different, right? Why do we like a parrot that talks? Because it's not normal. And so it's the things that are different, like Jews and Gentiles. If there's healthy respect, it's actually quite nice. People like this stuff. So the bottom line is that unity is the goal. I remember speaking to a guy, a guy in Crown Heights, I forget his name, real character. So he's having a farbrengen, and the guy's into he's like a fun guy. He does all these things. I said, we should have something of content here. We should speak something. He says, you don't understand what a farbrengen is all about. He tells me, farbrengen is about this, getting together, having fun. In a certain sense, he's true. It's right. Now, I'm not saying that it's not important to have content, but if all you're doing in life is taira, 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 mitzvah, 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 you've lost the point. Because the whole point of life is unity. And that's what Chassidus really brings to the world. It brings to the world the idea of, just Shavas Achim Gam Yachad. The whole idea of Farbrengen is a Chassidish idea, right? Just getting together, have some hearing, have some mashke, help each other out in a nice way. And this is what Hashem wants. Hashem wants unity. So it's very, very important to understand this. To the extent that we find that Hashem says you could erase my name. One of the third of the 10 commandments, don't take my name in vain. It's on a parchment, it's on a scroll, and you're erasing Hashem's name just for unity. That's what it was about. It was about creating unity. So when we understand this, and this is really the real war that goes on in the world. The Rebbe says that the Satan puts most of his efforts into breaking up marriages. And he's pretty successful. Why? Because before a person goes out, they want to go out, they want to get married, there's a certain need that they have for the other. But once you're together with the other person, it's very easy to take the other person for granted. And now you spilled my soup and I'm upset. The point is that a person has to really appreciate that unity is the goal. I remember reading this from Rabbi Rabbi Simon Jacobs in his book Toward a Meaningful Life, where he writes there from the Rebbe that the goal of marriage is unity. So my first marriage, and I was married, and I said, okay, that's the goal. The goal is unity. And it was amazing when unfortunately I didn't keep it for long enough, but for 2 weeks, so all the stupid things didn't matter anymore, because it doesn't matter. The goal is unity. It's a very powerful concept. If a person understands that the goal is unity, then basically there would be no wars, there would be no hate, there'd be nothing. Why? Because all these things are ego things. My ego got hurt from this guy. But if you understand that, no, it doesn't matter. The goal is unity. So it doesn't matter if you're a little upset. The only thing that matters, are we friends? Are we together? Are we friends? And if we have that in mind, then we are able to forego. We're able to forgive, because the goal, ultimately what drives a human being, is their primary goal. And we all have many, many goals in life, but it's the primary goal that wins. And that's our key in life, is figuring out what is the primary goal. And the primary goal, the number one reason Hashem made this world, is for unity. And so it's very important to understand that Torah Mitzvahs is not here because Hashem needs me to eat kosher. Torah Mitzvahs is here, like the Rabbi Shab says, brought down Rambam many different places, to refine us, to actually humble ourselves so we could be in unity. So we have to have an ego, because you can't have people getting together unless they have egos, unless there is separation, unless there is uniqueness. But at the same time, all the Torah mitzvahs, it says the whole Torah was given lasei shalom ba'olam, to create peace in the world. And we really have to wrap our heads around this, because, Baruch Hashem, we have a religion that's thousands of years old. And then eventually it becomes about the religion. The definition is the religion itself. But what if the religion itself is about something else? What if the religion is about unity? And so we have to keep that in mind. Of course, we know the most important mitzvah of the Torah is love your friend. And the Rebbe says very clearly that is not about love. It's not about some random idea, have love. No, because if you have love, you'll have unity. So Avas Yisrael is about Achdus Yisrael. In fact, the very last sikh of the Rebbe was Achdus Yisrael, how to create unity. So obviously unity is a very complex thing to create, because you have to create differences. You can't have unity unless you have differences. And so we just have to appreciate that the differences themselves are there for the unity. And this is how you know a philosophy is a kosher philosophy or is an unkosher philosophy, whether it's a Jewish philosophy or non-Jewish philosophy, is it creating unity or not? And so certainly within Judaism, we see that Chassidus is a unifying, it's a philosophy that created unity in the world. When you're talking about certainly there's a lot today in the radical left or the radical right, they always position themselves, they're about justice. But justice is really about vengeance. It's not about, nobody goes to court. Hello, Shalom Aleichem. Welcome, welcome. No one goes to court and says, you know what? I'm here to bring this guy to court because I want unity. No, you want justice. You're upset. You basically want either vengeance or maybe justice. He stole $10,000 from you. You want the $10,000 back. We're speaking about the idea that everything's about unity, the why of life. So the point is that the movements that are all about justice are really about vengeance. They're not about justice. If you want to move forward in life, I lived in South Africa. So South Africa, there was a lot of terrible crimes against the black people from the apartheid government. But the new government, actually people don't know this, that the Rebbe was very much the one that positioned them. There's an interesting story. I'll tell you that I heard directly from the person himself. There's a guy, his name is Louis Perlman. Louis Gavin. Louis Gavin, like many of the Jews, were against, obviously racism, this and that. And he was hired by Nelson Mandela, the new black government, to run their campaign. So he's a media guy, to run their media campaign. And he asked the Rebbe if he should. Now, at that time, there was still an outlawed organization. The Rebbe said to him he should do it. He should do it quietly. And he said, and you should lead the direction in peace. That the direction of the government should be peace. So their motto, and it made a very big difference. Why? Because he told me, and he done this publicly on the My Story, that one of the ad campaigns that one of, I guess, the black leaders wanted was like, they stole our land, now they want to steal our vote. He said, no, that's not our ad campaign. And basically, to his credit, and to the credit of Nelson Mandela and other of the black leaders, they have this positive campaign where a Rainbow Nation is for everybody, all this kind of stuff. So the Rebbe was very much directly responsible for this idea that, yes, they're having freedom, but in a way of unity. And for example, Zimbabwe, which I don't know if people know about it, but Robert Mugabe, I don't know if he's still alive, that took over the country, and he was what I call black racist. He took away farms from the white people. He really was very destructive. He basically destroyed his own country. Because anybody that's looking for vengeance, they say if a person has hate in their heart, they should take 2 spades, 2 shovels. Well, the first shovel, they're trying to bury someone else. The second shovel, they're burying themselves. They say, what is resentment? It's taking poison and waiting for the enemy to die. So the point is that the way forward in life is unity. And that's the critical question if a person wants to know, is my philosophy a good philosophy or not? Is this philosophy about unity? If the philosophy is about justice, it's evil. Because what really justice is usually about, and this is what a lot of people don't realize, some of the black radicalism, there were fringe movements, as some of them come more into the mainstream, but they were murderers. They were evil people. And that wasn't the message of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King's message was a message of unity. It wasn't a message of suddenly the blacks are going to be masters and whites are slaves. So this whole thing that's going on, white privilege, it's racism, because what is, non-racism is you don't look at the skin color. But if you're looking at any skin color, that's pure racism, no matter how you're looking at it. And so people that are really seeking to make a better world are the people that are leading everybody towards unity. And those are the leaders that we want and we need. And the only way you can look at a philosophy and say, is this philosophy a good philosophy or evil philosophy, is the philosophy creating unity or not? And even within our own, we're not mentioning names, but there are certain groups who, even within Orthodox Judaism, that they're very elitist and about their little ideas of Torah and this and that. And they're not creating unity amongst the Jewish world, or amongst the world in general. It's just like an elitist movement. So these movements are, the correct movements is unity. And the way that Hashem wants the world to go is a way of unity. And that's why you'll see with the tzaddikim, everything is about shalom and shalom bayis. As much as possible, unity is the way. But in order to have unity, you have to have humility. Because basically, the ego is always about trying to be better and bigger than the other. But humility is the opposite. Humility is, it's natural for people to want unity. Everybody wants unity, but the ego is going to tell is kind of supremacy, and for unity has to be a goal. Because ironically, we all have an ego, and you have to have an ego, but you have to put your ego in the direction of unity, and that's the critical thing here. You have to say, okay, my life is about unity. And then if somebody doesn't have unity, or even if somebody's against you, you can almost laugh it off, because it's not about my goal is unity. And it's not part of my structure. And that's what evil always tries to do. I think not many people realize the real goal of evil is to create disunity. Right? It says, I think it was Sfas Emes that says that Vayero Isanu HaMitzrim. The Egyptians did evil to us. So he says, Vayero, they wanted us to be evil. Very interesting. People, Einstein even speaks about this. He says, what were the Germans against? The Germans couldn't be against the Jews, as the Jews come from a nation, a race, because Jews come from all races, right? Look at Israel. They're every single color of Jew imaginable is right here in Eretz Yisrael. So Jews are not a race. They're a religion or a soul. So he said, they were against the social justice within every Jew. And that's true. We're actually Yom HaShoah Day. It's very important for people to understand, because those people that are against Jews, and those people, Martin Luther King actually spoke about this, that some black people that were anti-Semitic, and he said, well, anti-Israel. He said, that is an anti-Semitic thing to do. Why? Because what are you against? That people have a land? They're not entitled to have a land. So it's purely, there's really no such thing as anti-Semitic. The word anti-Semitism comes from a German kind of philosopher. He wanted to sound sophisticated. They came up with this whole thing about, different races. They called the Jews Semites. Nothing to do with anti. There's a guy now, Robert Kraft, that came out with a whole campaign. He put $20 million into getting, combating anti-Semitism. So he put out a nice advertisement. He says, stand up against Jewish hate. So that's very good, because that's what they're against Jews. That's what they're against. And what are they ultimately against? I think Hitler was the only anti-Semite that really understood what he was against. He was against the soul of the Jew. He was against the goodness and the kindness. That's why he said, if there's a Jew, even the descendant of a Jew, they killed Goyim, they killed non-Jews. The guy's grandfather was a Jew, they killed him. It's a regular German citizen. He's literally not Jewish. But he felt that this guy has some of the goodness of a Jew in him. And he was whatever he was, maybe it's a Shandal. It was about evil, purely making evil. And he says clearly it was in Auschwitz. They have on the walls there that he was like, they wanted to make a race of barbarians, a race of savages. Why? Because for whatever reason, he was a savage. He became a savage. And there's fundamentally a human being is compassionate. So what makes a person into a savage? Makes them because they're defensive. And in their defensiveness, they become aggressive. And they then become jealous of people that are not defensive. It's like anxiety, basically. That person that's running in anxiety becomes a bully, right? Why? Because subconsciously, why should I be feeling this suffering while you're not? That's why when COVID came out, fortunately, I sort of predicted that there would be domestic violence. Why? Because you can't put people in homes together 24 hours a day, and then the tension, and then it creates a subconscious jealousy. And this is what happened, because people need to feel good about themselves, right? And when you feel good about yourself, part of being married, by the way, is an important thing, is staying far away from times. One of the most important things for Shalom Bayis is getting out of the house for a good amount of the day. Because if people are always together, you have to have, the Baal Shem Tov says that a relationship is like a dance that they go in and out. And the big problem today is people are together too often. Like, in the olden days, I think the women had girlfriends and the guys had guy friends, and you came together, so it's special. But if everything you're expecting is from this other person, it's unhealthy. It's not tenable. It's an unhealthy relationship, and that's what a lot of the relationships are today. So I can go on and on and on the subject. I don't want to go on and on. But what I do want to summarize is that ultimately we're in Yom HaShoah today, so it's very important to speak about this, which is that ultimately, if you think about terrorism, you think about Nazism, which is really the same thing, is what were they after? And there are a lot of people, unfortunately, that don't understand, a lot of the Jews included, that have been bought into the radical left. And there were many Germans that were normal people, and they just ideologically they thought that Hitler actually stood for something. He didn't stand for anything. He was a terrorist. That's what he was. He was about terror, and he didn't care about Germany. His whole theory, his whole philosophy was baloney. He never believed his own philosophy. It was all an excuse to be able to terrorize people. The only time he was happy, we see on pictures, he was not a happy person, was when he would imagine bombs falling on England, which he did, just to terrorize people. So he himself lived in terror. Now you think about what was his terror. Very interesting. There's a psychologist that said that it was a guy who studied anxiety his whole life. And so there are two sources of anxiety in this world. One is from things, and the other is from people. So the Germans are brought up in a very, very vicious way. There's no love there. And so they develop an anxiety around people. And so a person what is anxiety ultimately? It's fear. And that fear can come from anything. So a person can be afraid of getting criticized. That's why many Americans, it's an amazing thing, Americans will get on a TV show and tell the whole world about their mother and their father and their boyfriend. There's like no fear of judgment, right? They're living in this environment where if you thought people are going to criticize you after the show, you wouldn't do it. So they're living in this environment of openness. Like you see some of the young people today, it's very cute. Like they're sitting on the sidewalk and they're doing the things like they see the world as being this lovey-dovey place. So ultimately, how do you find terrorism? How does it express itself? It expresses itself in literally trying to create anxiety in other people, and that's why it's random acts of violence, and that's why many of the Nazis themselves probably weren't aware of what was going on. They were creating evil, random acts of violence to terrorize. But ultimately, the whole thing is insane. Why is it insane? Because you're not God. And every generations die and they're reborn. And everybody that's born is born compassionate. You can't kill compassion. Compassion is the essence of the soul. Somebody recently told me a very interesting thing, that a person wrote to the Rebbe that he's living unhappy. The Rebbe says there's no such thing as a human being that's living unhappy. Because if you're unhappy, you're not living. And if you're living, you're happy. Because life and happiness is one and the same. And you can't kill. Children are born. Children are happy. So you can't kill. It's impossible to kill. Now, the responsibility to become happy lies on the individual. That's why I wrote a book called Kabbalah Love, From Fear to Love. There are techniques that people have to get happy. If a person has anxiety, they can go to therapy. There are ways of dealing with it. But the way of dealing with it in terms of being mean to somebody else, not the way. And to a certain extent, it's a responsibility of those that don't have anxiety to help those that do, because it's very difficult to help oneself. And I actually went through a period of anxiety, and Baruch Hashem, I have to say I'm very lucky. First of all, circumstances were in my favor. Second of all, Chassidus was in my favor, so I understood what was happening, and I had tools. And even then, I could say, it took years on my little machine. It wasn't easy to get out of it, because actually it's a separate response they call it the vagus nerve, a separate response within the human being. And once that response gets implemented, it's like a kind of you want to call it adrenaline, fight or flight. Once you are in that stage, it's very, very difficult to get into that stage. It's very difficult to get out of the stage because the brain doesn't want the person to get there. But once you're there, it's very, 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 very hard to get out of it. And I remember I wrote to a guy, there's a guy who became a Chabad, a very big psychiatrist. The name is Dr. Joseph Berker. He wrote a lot of books. And so I wrote to him, okay, Baruch Hashem, I kind of came out of it, but how do we help people that are in it? Because when you're in it, you see everybody that has it. Like everybody, a person that's hungry sees people that are hungry, people that have back pain, you see people in back pain. But if you're out of it, it's like you don't see it that much. So he said to me, he wrote back 2 words, and this is a guy that had a mental health clinic. We're talking about a top guy. He said, be joyous, be happy. Why? Because if you walk around being happy, then what happens is, then you're automatically taking away one of the greatest anxieties that people have, which is people. And that's why you'll notice a person that's happy makes everybody happy. It's the guy that could be miserable, this and that. But somebody that's happy walks through the room. Suddenly, a guy for 20 years, he didn't smile, he starts to smile. Why? Because he really wants to smile. Everybody b'teva, everybody by nature it says, we want pleasure. We don't want to feel pain. We want to feel happy. But it takes sometimes somebody's happiness to give us that feeling of safety to feel happy. We know, oh wow, this guy can be happy around. Because ultimately, the person that has anxiety, the terrorist, what's he feeling? He's feeling unsafe, and he's acting in a certain way. Subconsciously, he thinks that if I behave like the person that bullied me, I won't get terrorized. And meanwhile, he then becomes the bully to the next person. So it's like this bad cycle. But if a person says, no, I'm going to be the happy person no matter what. So what happens is, and the other person says, oh, I could be happy too. Like you think about the Rebbe, how much happiness the Rebbe, not only the Rebbe, all the Rebbes gave the world. Because if he can be happy, I can be happy. And I think that's one of the most important things, certainly from the perspective of Kabbalah, is that we could do is being happy. So number one, in terms of this idea of creating unity, we have to literally work very hard at being happy. And just to conclude, I'm not really doing justice to the subject, but I don't want to keep everybody for too long. But the other major reasons why Shem made the world was apart from unity. And as we say, for unity, we have to be happy and stay away from any philosophy of negativity. And the media is terrible because the media creates this war and starts to say these guys are bad, whether it's the right or the left. I used to watch the right media, whatever you call it. I think the left is worse than the right, but still, it's too negative. There's no question about it. It's negative, and it's about what's wrong and when these people are bad. And life is about what's right. It's not about what's wrong. You know the famous saying from Menachem Mendel, of course. What's the difference between a lover of truth? You heard this one? And a hater of falsehood? He says, huh? It's a very good line. He says, yeah, you know this one? Lover of truth and a hater of falsehood. What's the difference between a lover of truth and a hater of falsehood? A lover of truth doesn't rest until he finds the truth, and a hater of falsehood doesn't rest until he finds what's false. It's a very, very deep line. Again, it's like what I was saying before, the beginning point. In other words, some people in life are hurt. Let's say a person, this guy, he wrote an article about this, about again, we're not trying to minimize this terrible history that happened to the black people, but one black person said, oh, I didn't see racism, right? And then I became aware, and now I see it everywhere. Sure, if you're looking for something, you'll see it everywhere. But if you're looking for love, you'll see love everywhere. Whatever you're looking for, you're going to see everywhere. That's the difference between a lover of truth and a hater of falsehood. The guy that's looking for truth will see truth everywhere, because both exist. But the question is, what are you looking for? And our goal in life is look for unity. Look for creating unity. And it's all over. Everybody wants to have unity with you. The whole world loves you, unity, so you can have love with the world. And that's the last message of the Rebbe, was that you have a mitzvah of Ahavas Yisrael to every single Jew. Your job is to have unity with every single Jew. And if you look at it that way, then everything else was water off a duck's back. It doesn't matter what this guy says, what that guy says, and certainly never become part of a movement or a person that says, oh, we got to hate this person today, because all of that is the negative space, not the positive space. So, we have a lot more to say, but we're going to conclude with that.